Okay, good afternoon. Are we ready? Getting ready? Slowly getting ready? Okay. Thank you for bearing with us. We had our coffee, so I think we are ready to kick off with the fourth panel of today. What future for EU democracy? That's our topic, and we will have 4 presentations. We will start with Sergio, Fabbrini, and then followed by Zielonka, and then a trio, Marta, Warat, Karolina, Czerska-Shaw, and Tiziano, Zgaga, and then last but not least, Pavol, Babos, and Joseph Batora, who will join us very soon. So, Sergio, the floor is yours.
First, before starting, let me thank Magda for this organization and the group working with her. And thanks, Magda, and the group for the organization, which is really wonderful. Also, thanks, Jan-Erik, for this project. It was very interesting intellectually, but also a lot of fun. And so I think, Jan-Erik, you did a wonderful job. As Louis, we work on, in particular, political leaders. So with Tiziano, we did the work on right-wing nationalists and try to understand how they transformed themselves after Brexit. And we ended up to talk them sovereignist, so it is not the nationalism that you know in the past, and they try to adapt to the European Union, to endogenize nationalism. Then we did a policy brief in which we look at the national government contribution to the Conference on Future of Europe, and that will be a policy brief, I think, with Bruegel, and already published by EU3D Arena. This presentation look to the, let's say, the debate in Brussels concerning the new enlargement. So I look at the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine and the discussion that is open now on the necessity to accommodate this new enlargement, and the question raised is differentiation the recipe for that. So in presenting my, I hope to see a little bit heterodox approach, is a institutional analysis, intellectual exercise, no more than that. I look to what I call teleological approach, according to the teleological approach that you find in many national leaders, but also in many Brussels political leaders, also functionaries. The Russian war has made the EU enlargement inevitable. Its institution can integrate new countries and still functioning through differentiation. Of course, in the case of Olaf Scholz, this is conditional to introduce some limited reform, majority reform in fiscal policy, in security policy. So I try to let's say, to open a space, an intellectual space, regarding a non-teleological approach. In the past, according to this non-teleological approach, enlargement with differentiation have strengthened the intergovernmental governance of the EU, reducing democracy and creating dominance. I come from comparative politics, so I use a very empirical concept of dominance or domination, which is a relational concept, which concern, in this interpretation, the lack of an equivalent power able to check the power taking decision. So starting from Madison, arriving to Dahl, the idea is always dominance can be, need to be neutralized, creating an equivalent institution to the one that we can consider dominant in order to check and balance. The contribution by Dahl, for example, was the huge research on the opposition. And you always consider the opposition starting in 1930 in Britain as the way in which you can check and balance in a parliamentary system the power of the government. So I consider dominance the affirmation of a political system in which one institution takes decision and does not receive any equivalent check and balance from another institution. So this is a very parsimonious. I am a student of Giovanni Sartori, so I don't move out of there, okay? So the EU as a political system. So mainstream EU studies, which has become current currency in Brussels, consider the EU as a permanent process rather than as an institutional outcome. This process approach to the European Union comes mainly from international relation background. Both intergovernmental and neo-functionalists have this clear or unclear, explicit or inexplicit international relation view, which is crucial because that means that many issues that comparative politics people raise are not raised in that tradition of thought. So for them, at the very end, the European Union can be an international organization. So the post-Maastricht EU, from a comparative politics approach, has acquired instead a very stable decision-making system. I call that system dual governance, and is constituted by two ideal types and heuristics. One is the supranational governmental system for dealing with regulatory policies, and the other one is intergovernmental governance system for dealing with core state power. Because of international relation background, many studies do not investigate institutions. The same Frank Schimmelfenning acknowledged in a contribution to SIEPS, a Swedish institute, that we don't know very much about institution. We know more about process. So the literature on differentiation has mainly focused on policy differentiation, never or very limited on governance differentiation. And that can explain why differentiation is so problematic in the mainstream literature. So differentiation considered in Brussels, when this approach became common wisdom in Brussels, is mainly a differentiation connected to the single market. Is an instrumental differentiation, again, to use Tom Whitson and Frank's interpretation. It is a contingent differentiation necessary for allowing the new member state, as we did in the 90s, especially in 2004, 2007, to allow them to adapt to the acquis communautaire. So the teleology of the Rome Declaration of 25 of March 2017 is the EU is undivided and undivisible. So you can have different speeds, say the document, and the document is still, in a way, the public philosophy of the EU. You can have different speeds toward the same direction. Everybody wants to go towards closer union, although with different speed. So in the debate as I follow in this 10 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the same approach is used. Look at the intervention by Scholz, first in Prague, then in Heidelberg, is always there. The new countries can be integrated even faster than the previous country because of the war, using differentiation. And again, the view is always about differentiation in a single market. Again, in exchange, you need to give us la passerelle, the majority vote, the unanimity in order to vote according to a majority principle. So, but differentiation is not only instrumental. It has also a constitutional identity in nature. And it is emerged not in the single market. It has emerged in a significant way, at least for a scholar, in core state power. And those close state power are characterized by differentiation because those powers are close to national sovereignty. So what we have in the last 2 decades is that the political process in Europe, politicization of Europe, has to do with sovereignty issue. Sovereignty is the center of the political debate. And here the question concerns the identity, the sovereignty of the member state. And those implicitly, in many cases, we found in other cases very explicitly, look at the document of the Hungarian government to the Conference on Future of Europe, also they express a clear idea on the finality of the integration. So when you have sovereignty division, when we have division on national identity, there is only one governance system able to accommodate the division, which is not the supranational of the regulatory policy of the single market, but is the intergovernmental governance. This is why there is a lack, in my view, of the fact that there is no clear institutional analysis about governance or differentiation. Because if you analyze governance differentiation, you understand the implication, the negative effects of intergovernmentalism. So, and in that affirmation of intergovernmental governance, you have a champion which is overshadowing everything in Europe, which is the European Council. And the European Council is the only crucial institution for dealing with sovereignty division. You cannot deal with sovereignty division through the triangle, Commission, Parliament, Council. The only way in which you can deal with sovereignty division is to concentrate, monopolize decision within European Council. But which are the implications of that for the process of European integration? Not from the perspective of an international organization, but from the perspective of at least of their own treaty. The preamble say an ever closer union. And not only that, but the European Council in some way try to escape from this criticism, saying, but we are constituted by people elected in our national, let's say, institution, by our national electorate, we are accountable to our national parliament, but when they decide in the European Council, they decide as a collectivity, as a collegial body, not as a sum of single individuals. And in that sense, my parsimonious interpretation of dominance as an institution without an equivalent check from another institution of the same level enter in the picture. The European Parliament has no power of sanction on European Council. A national parliament can check the single member state leader within the European Council, but not the European Council as such. Sorry. So here I discuss about the various identity or sovereignty division that we have in Europe in the last 15 years. And here I can stop because, of course, I do understand that any other solution to escape from that is not realistic, is in a way impossible, implausible. However, in this presentation, I try to make an attempt to see an alternative, at least theoretically. What I call plural Europe model, in part has been opened up by the view of Macron on the European political community, but there is some debate, but not significant debate on that. I do understand clearly that this requires not reforming the treaty, but exiting from the treaty. So anyway, the teleology of EU undivided and indivisible creates probably opportunity to go on, but in some way raise also a lot of trouble, would increase the intergovernmentalization of the European Union, would transform the European Union in international organization. It is that we want. Are we aware of that? If not, probably it's time to think before to enlarge. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergio. And now over to Jan.
Thank you, thank you. I should warn you immediately that after what Sergio said, you will think that I came from another galaxy. But, you know, because I'm interested in studying not so much formal institutions, but informal ones, for which we have rather inadequate methods and theories. So we are walking a little bit in the dark, and therefore the short intervention is only sensible in a panel about the future, because we know very little about the future. The problem is that those informal, non-hierarchical actors are ever more powerful. And most important factors, in my view, here was the digital revolution. And if you read people who really study the digital revolution, like Castells, they will tell you that networks are the greatest beneficiaries. And I will not explain why, because he published 3 volumes on this. And people actually say that Castells is a passé. In media studies, they consider him passé. It was 30 years ago. But in political science, the argument that you have to study networks rather than states or international organizations is still basically a crime. The problem we have is that whatever you call the European Union, there are more and more scholars like Anne-Marie Slotes who will tell you it behaves more and more like a network, if only because all the treaty arrangements are frozen for 30 years, as you said. You can, you know, life goes on. We run now from one emergency to another, and we learn through all this crisis that the Union has to respond. And if they go according to the letter of all formal arrangements, they could simply close the shop, right? But I myself have a task in this project to study other level of governance, which are cities, which also increasingly behave like networks rather than formal organizations, living more in the shadow of laws and try not to assert sovereignty, but try to solve problems as they go along. And all this sovereignist discourse which Sergio described so well, you know, I just read this morning the speech of Prime Minister of this country, Morawiecki, in Heidelberg. I think he mentioned sovereign nation state 25 times or something. Okay. He mentioned more frequently sovereign nation state than Macron mentioned sovereign Europe, you know. Probably there was a competition. But, you know, but you cannot keep forever the situation in which those who have formal powers cannot contribute less than actors without formal access to the decisions of resources. And you have seen through all crises that, you know, how it was basically done. We had a conference in Venice, some of you were there. We tried to examine pandemics and how multi-level government works during pandemics. And what was the pandemic? The hour of nation state, yeah? They closed borders, they bit even to trade medical equipment within single market. I mean, but very quickly they realized that it doesn't work this way, because borders are important, but not between Italy and France, but between Lombardia and Veneto or Campania, right? When president of Campania said, well, I don't want those people from Lombardia. He didn't have anything against French or English, you know. He didn't want those who had the summer houses, you know, in Ischia, to come there and infect them, you know. Then the Prime Minister realized that, you know, surprise, surprise, health authority is in the hands of the regions and not in the state, in the hands of the government, right? And the regions were tough cookies. And then they realized that if they want to have vaccines and don't want to engage in vaccine nationalism, they need EU to do this, which had little experience, actually, to get those vaccines. I had a feeling that they negotiated initially like they negotiate potatoes. But at the end of the day, it was better than rich countries in the EU getting those vaccines and poor ones nothing. And then, of course, there was a bill from all these measures they adopted with the COVID, and somebody had to help. And there was again the European Union who had to help. So these hours of Europe, and by the way, Morawiecki, which spoke just recently in Heidelberg, again came with this myth, pandemic showed the renaissance of nation state. What? This is not what we found out from those who spoke at this conference. And you can go to other issues, and you can see more or less the same, that a lot of problems are being solved by actors who do not have particular authorities to do this, but they cannot be left out. Migration is a beautiful example. This country opened the border with Ukraine for refugees. How many, Magda? How many millions initially crossed the border?
5 million.
Yeah. 6.5. But they opened border because they are in charge of borders, but they didn't move finger, right? Who had to host those refugees? Municipalities, NGOs, private spontaneous associations, right? They had to do this. And it is exactly like this in the field of immigration for years. I spoke recently, you know, in Amsterdam with members of the city council, and they said, no, we have now sovereign, you know, Rutte is more and more sovereignist, and there is a new law which forbids us to build accommodations for migrants because the Dutch should have priority. Well, easy said than done. If we will follow the law, these people will sleep on the street in the center of Amsterdam. We cannot afford this. There will be a lot of other problems, and then they will come to us with complaints. Why I'm saying those things? I'm saying those things because, in my view, Castles was right, that problems cannot just disappear on their own, and they cannot be handled by decrees. And we increasingly, and Jonathan probably will say more about this because he wrote a lot about the emergency governance in Europe for already several years. They run basically in emergency mode, and because there is no other options. You can call it illegitimate, but democracy cannot be just participatory and rely on check and balance, parliamentary controls and everything. It has also to deliver. Because if you don't fix vaccines, many people will die. If you don't know how to accommodate migrants, you expect a lot of other problems, and so on and so on. I'm not even talking about climate change, because our governments made time and again pledges which they broke. We are now going back to coal, and if we wouldn't have NGOs with no formal powers, I mean, when I read criticism of Greta Thunberg, you know, who is Greta Thunberg? What is her legitimacy to speak on behalf of people, well, it reminds me, you know, Stalin questioned how many tanks divisions has the Pope. I mean, sometimes those power doesn't come from formal, you can say, authority. But if this is increasingly so, if, let's say, internet change the notions of time and space, because we are more, borders are kind of, we are more unbounded, space is shrinking, and the time is shrinking, basically. Then we have a big democracy problem, because how you legitimize all that? I mean, it just doesn't fit to anything what we talk about, because our thinking about democracy is status, you know, divisions of power, elections, you know, parliamentary representation, check and balances. Well, and how to deal with those networks? I mean, first you have to establish what kind of networks we are dealing with, because networks are not only cities, networks are the criminal organizations are too. Mafia is a kind of networks too. You know, then you have to understand how networks operate differently than states. And then you try to figure out whether you have some mechanisms other than representation, say contestation, deliberation, participations, which can be applied to this new world emerging, right? And I fear that the conclusion would be that we would have to totally change our mindset to talk about this, because our language and concepts do not apply to this world. But things are not so bad, because this is not all or nothing game. And here I finish. You see, you know, when I worked for Solidarność in the 80s, you know, I worked to the International Labour Organization. And the International Labour Organization was a tripartite body. There were states, there were employers, and there were employees. And they could sort out things in a different way than normal organizations controlled by states, yeah? And I think this is a better solution than the idea of sovereignists, you know, that they will just build Europe of sovereign nation states, because problem of those states is that their interests differ. But this is what we have. They go to the European Council, they don't boycott European Council meetings like de Gaulle, but they always come out of these meetings and in front of the cameras and say what they have done for their nation. And they are supposed to do this because they are elected by their own people. And this just doesn't work. So we don't have a collapse of Europe, but we have something, you know, a politics of faking politics, so to speak, that they pretend to solve problems, but they really don't. They pretend to respond to the electoral needs or listen to the electorate, and the electorate pretends that they just trust that they will do this. I mean, France, I just came back from France. I mean, Macron just was elected. Where's his authority? But it's not first time, because after first time he was elected, there were yellow vest demonstrations. And you can say this is how democracy works, because protest is a normal, you know, part of daily democracy. But I think there is a problem, that people still go to vote, but this vote doesn't transfer in the mandate for those who govern. And if this is the case, people probably understand, which doesn't come necessarily from our surveys, because we don't ask those questions, that the formal mechanism of democracy is problematic. But instead of putting it all on the open sea and wait and see whether they will arrive somewhere or sink, you can simply adjust things. You can allow those networks which are willing and able to contribute to public affairs to take part in decision-making process. Not as we have done with, for instance, Pact of Amsterdam, where the Union formally recognized that cities can make contributions to public life of Europe. Thank you very much. Most of us live in the cities. Majority of people live in the cities. It is like Juncker was saying, you know, I invite European citizens to make a contribution to democracy in Europe. I thought European citizens were sovereign. You know, invite people to make contribution to democracy. See, but it didn't give cities any access to decision and resources. And the same, and Sergio described very well, is with the European Union. The role of EU is increasingly contested in the sovereign notion of politics. And this is not sustainable, and we can find practical solutions how to address this, but I already spoke too long, so I should stop.
Okay, and now
you need to come here.
To our trio, yeah, Tiziano, Karolina, and Marta.
Please, come here.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, illuminated.
Yeah. Movement to get us going.
And I can say this, I can manage. Yes, sorry. Okay, thank you very much also from my side for 4 very enriching and stimulating years. I learned a lot from all of you. So today, Karolina, Marta, and I will present some findings of political and social actor proposal for European integration, but also disintegration. Next slide, please. So in Work Package 5, you know that we collected reform proposals on the future of Europe in order to identify different constitutional narratives. Next slide, please. So Lewis and Jagiellonian University were coordinating this process of collecting reform proposals, and then the whole colleagues contributed to this. We focused on political and non-political actors from all European member states, but with a focus on those countries where we had colleagues with expertise and language skills. But we also looked at the EU institutions and the European level public sphere. And we have a massive amount of proposals, more than 1,000 proposals constituting this database. And we are currently cleaning this database, and we will soon upload it on the webpage of Arena in order to make it available for all of you and for also external researchers. I would like to thank Magda and the team at Duke for cooperating very well on this. So this was also based, of course, on a specific code book that we developed. So it was a very in-depth process of collecting and then analyzing reform proposals. Next slide, please. So since we are still cleaning this database, I can present only some preliminary findings. I would like to thank Raquel Ugarte-Dietz, who did these charts for us. So as you can see, we looked at the extent to which the proposals mentioned the 4 types of differentiation. it is interesting to know that functional differentiation was the most often mentioned type, and I think this confirms this policy focus that we were stressing before, because functional differentiation is about new or different policies or policy instruments to be integrated. Whereas other types of differentiation that required deeper elaboration, so for instance territorial differentiation, as we know about a core Europe and a multi-speed Europe, or lawmaking differentiation, which is specifically about the relationship between institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, these were comparatively less present. Next slide, please. So still, among lawmaking differentiation, a very important question for us was about the powers of the European Parliament. Here you can see that very clearly a majority of proposals were actually in favor of increasing the EP's powers with regard to initiating legislation and also to co-decide it. And this shows that not only pro-European proposals, but also Eurosceptic proposals, if there was something that they accepted, probably in changing the European institutional setup, it was to grant more powers to the European Parliament. Next slide, please. Then, together with Sergio Fabbrini and other colleagues, our Lewis team examined proposals emerged from the Conference on the Future of Europe, as was already mentioned, and we elaborated 3 models of integration coming out of this, so the economic community, the parliamentary model, and the intergovernmental model. But we argued that these 3 models were unable to deal with the negative implications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and this is why we advanced a 4th model, which is the federal union model. And very briefly, this is a model based on a compromise, because it accepts more integration of those policies that will allow the EU to become more capable, so to have more resources in fiscal terms, but also to have more military and security capabilities. But on the other side, it accepts a repatriation of those policies, particularly with regard to the single market, that member states can more effectively deal with at their own level. So it is a model that is not suggesting an either-or approach, so more integration, more disintegration, but it is more flexible, and this is why, in our view, it is also less conducive to patterns of dominance and more conducive to democracy, and I'm happy to discuss this later on. Last slide from my part. I focused on Italy in Work Package 5, and this is a good example of the policy focus of the reform proposals, because also here the proposals very much linked to crises affecting the country, and you can see this in fiscal and migration policy, for instance. But without further ado, I give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziano. So now I'd like to take our discussion to the narratives of political and social actors present on the European level of claims making and proposals. And just as a caveat, the voices, the proposals that we tried to capture, we tried to go outside of the mainstream debates, on the future of Europe. We don't have time to go into all of the proposals and the actors' contestation, and the deliberation of the locations of dominance in the EU polity. You can look to our report for those answers. Unfortunately, I cannot boast that our report is already online, but it will be out imminently. So what we'd like to focus on here is actually 4 main tropes of the narratives on the future of Europe in these proposals coming from political and social actors. And the first main trope, as we've actually already very much discussed today, is the trope of sovereignty. And the contentious location thereof. So sovereignty, as has been noted, actually by our colleagues Magda, Katarzyna and Elodie in their contribution to the report, is actually an empty signifier, right? So it is filled by political, cultural, and economic, oftentimes, dimensions. And its location, as we know, is highly contested. Yeah, from an own European sovereignty, right? The discourse is on own European sovereignty, which I think much to the chagrin of Emmanuel Macron and perhaps Jon Erik here and others in the room, was scarcely present, you know, in the proposals. Okay, so that sovereignty, that location of that sovereignty on the European level was scarcely present. Two proposals for the selective pooled sovereignty, or the federal nested in the national sovereignty, but increasingly more so, popular sovereignty. Yeah, that we saw in the discourses of the social actors as well as the political actors. And also, you know, often, sometimes even to the fringes, yeah, of those denialist movements, as our colleague Kinga research, and so-called truth-seeking sovereignty. So we have a real kind of diversity of sovereignties, yeah, that we're talking about. But maybe going back to the discussion this morning about dominance and what is the antidote to dominance? And here, maybe we can posit that the antidote to dominance is sovereignty, yeah? Or so it seems like, or the absence of dominance is sovereignty, yeah? At least it seems like that is the case coming out in the narratives. What is evident is that the criticism of the EU, or the dominance of the EU, is at the heart of the narratives, whether highlighting its anti-democratic character, its hegemonic or excluding tendencies, or overextension of its competencies, so the Eurosceptic actors, denialist movements, or on the other hand, its insufficient, the insufficient capacity to act of the EU, as Jon Erik, you were saying this morning, or inadequate adherence to its own values of transparency or accountability, such as was pressed on by migration CSOs. So, in a sense, the EU is between a rock and a hard place, yeah? Between being a neoliberal hegemon and an inadequate protector of rights and legitimacy. It's in a tough spot. Okay, but the second trope. The narratives or the visions of Europe are also very much bound to discourses on common values and, you know, the concept of the good, yeah? The nature of the common values are, unsurprisingly, highly contested. Europe and the EU can perhaps be best described here as something of a disappointment. Yeah, we had high hopes, yeah, for the EU and our common values, but EU is not protecting our Christian values, you know, as our colleague Kasia noted in the faith-based organizations. It promised not to take away our national identity, yet it is a constant threat to the primacy of the nation state. And finally, it positions itself as a protector of human rights and the voice of minorities, which, while it has come a long way, social actors such as, you know, migration CSOs are increasingly disillusioned, pessimistic, and you know, calling out the hypocrisy of the EU as a normative power. Thank you. And then the third trope.
So another topic raised by the actors present at the European level is the idea of Europe of equal voices. And the debates on the future of Europe opened a Pandora box of discussion on the access or lack of access of different actors to the decision-making processes at the level of EU polity. And regardless of the political and social actors' ideological traditions, their worldviews, but also their positions to the EU, they all stress that the EU institutions face democratic deficit, And they argue for a need for the participatory turn to recognize and to include the voices of citizens, civil society organizations, or social movements, just to name a few. And this participatory turn is important not only to broaden the scope of actors who are involved in political decisions, but also it indicates and it questions the European integration as the elite project. So while there might be spaces of inclusions of differing voices and perspective, this open space is also threatening to the traditional locations of power and agency, namely by the EU institutions. And the last point we would like to highlight is related to the possibility of EU constitutionalism being hijacked by the illiberal voices. And in our work package, we aimed to map the sore points of European integration, the locations of dominance and its democratic malfunctioning. And we are especially interested in alternatives, EU governance models, and social or political actors who pushes for this kind of change. And in this context, a lot of work has been done by our colleagues on populism and illiberal turn. And they proved that one of the loudest push for change comes from these Eurosceptic voices. However, despite the fact that these voices are very vocal, they do not offer a coherent and a complex vision of Europe and reform of Europe, except for the general consolidation of power and dismantling of the rule of law. On the other hand, we need to note that they have become more professional and they are more familiar with the EU mechanism, which they use to achieve their own political goals. And we would like to leave you with the quote from one of the contributions to the report from Przemysław Tacik, who discusses the uncertain future of liberal constitutionalism. And we think that this is a good starting point for tomorrow's discussions during two panels on populism and whether the EU is able to adequately manage and respond to these illiberal challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have our last presentation from Pavol, Babos, and from Josef Batora right now. Yeah, so I pass the mic to you.
Should be here, right? Yes. Okay.
Okay. So what we have done in this paper, we were looking at thought communities and their implications for polity formation in the European Union. Now, what is the background here? So when you ask citizens, basically, what do what is the EU? And this is often and what is it you prefer about the EU? What are your attitudes towards the EU? Very often, they, you know, a lot of this research simply takes it for granted that people think about the EU in the same way, right? It doesn't necessarily think about the constructs that they use for thinking about the EU. And the EU is an object which is, as all of us will agree, is an uncertain and sort of an ambiguous object. It's not a given that people think about it in the same way, and it's actually quite important to get at the bottom of how people think about it. What is the thinking style that people use to conceptualize the EU before we start asking questions about attitudes towards the EU? So this is the starting point of our approach here, where we are trying to identify thinking styles about the EU among the population. We started in thinking about this using John Eric's 3 models that he has introduced in his paper 2021, where of course the EU can be thought of as a republican EU of sovereign states, federal union, that would be a federal state, and then of course a cosmopolitan union. And there's various kinds of literature this draws upon, but these are 3 paradigmatic models of how the EU could be organized. So, the question that we asked here, and this is also part of the task in the work package, is what is the support for these different models among the population in the EU member states? Now, to get at that, so to what extent would people embrace one of these models? What would be the preconditions for the support of one of these models among the population? So what we did then is we built upon the approach introduced by Amir Goldberg of trying to identify thought communities among a population. This builds on the idea of thought communities, of course, which goes back to Mannheim's work in the 1950s, but there's also Zerubbabel and others who have been working on, identifying constructs and scripts that people use to conceptualize political reality or other kinds of social realities. So how do people think about the EU when they hear the word EU? What is it that they think about? So what we basically did is we applied relational class analysis as an approach to analyze our data. And we used the R package that was also proposed and developed and programmed by Amir Goldberg. And then we had data, we used surveys which were 1,000 to 1,054 respondents from 6 member states, 3 big and older member states, that's France, Germany, and Italy, and then 3 newer and smaller member states, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. Poland maybe doesn't think about it as a smaller member state, but we somehow try to fit it into that category. It's a small, big member states, big, small member states, whatever you want to call it. But I think it fits the newer member states, right? Along with Slovakia and Hungary, of course. So what we had was a questionnaire with 10 statements with various aspects of European integration that were covered, and you will see some of that when we show you the heat maps. We were asking about some core dimensions in European integration related also to some of these models. So, questions like, should the EU have its own army, right? Should it have a directly elected president, right? And basically what you then do, and what the RCA program will do for you, is that it will collect and identify patterns in how people have responded to these. And that generates heat maps, and Pavol will talk about that in a moment, and that gives you those who have responded in similar ways, and then we have identified thought communities. In addition to these 10 items on the survey, we'll also ask questions about social demographic factors such as exposure to other EU member states, also party preferences, including populist parties, and preferences regarding the direction of European integration, as well as trust to some key EU institutions, because that, as you will see, will also tell us about which side of the spectrum these people will be falling within each of these thought communities. The basic idea here would be, of course, that every one of these thought communities uses a joint script, So in this line of thinking, you would have one of the communities which would be the statist community. In this case, you would have nationalist, sovereignist people in the same camp as European federalists, right? That's not often the case that you're thinking about it in this way, but this is how, they use the same script. It's basically the state script that they use in conceptualizing the EU. It's just a question of then looking at or at trust in EU institutions that then also shows you into which part of the spectrum they would fall within, right? Okay, I think Pavol, you can now take over and talk about the data and the findings.
So just a quick sentence or quick explanation to complement what Josef said. When we construct these thought communities, we basically don't care whether people like the EU or don't like the EU, whether they trust EU or don't trust EU. What we care about is how they think about the EU, what they imagine. If they close their eyes and we tell them, now imagine the EU, and what they see. And how to do that, we use this analytical method that Amir Goldberg developed and was further updated by other scholars and currently is widely used in political science and broader social science as well. So here you can see first findings. What we found in our most current and the most updated version of our research is that there are two thought communities. The first one we call statists, and the second one we call pragmatists. Why is it so? Because what we see there, or what we focus on there, is how those people link or not link together policies and the polity. So when they think about the EU, in which way do they think about the public policies on the one hand, or a polity, a political order or a political system on the other hand? And we are interested in how these two are linked in their minds. So, not only heat maps, but also such network diagrams you can create using this analysis. But this is just the graphical or visual aid. What is important is the description on the left-hand side. So what is typical for this thought community we call statists is that they think about the European Union as a federal state. Basically, they put polity and policies together. So there are people who want more public policies, or they want the European Union to deliver public policies, while at the same time they accept that for the EU to deliver public policies, the EU needs also a certain level of EU-level governance or EU-level institutions that have competencies to deliver such policies. So we argue that the thinking style of this thought community is centered around, or it is focused on the EU as a federal union or a federal state. Something you can imagine as in France or Germany. And this is called, well, to be precise, it is called dendrogram, but you can just say it's a correlation matrix. And it tells you how people's opinion or people's attitudes on 10 issues, 10 crucial issues we used as input for the RCA, how they correlate together. And basically, I see on your faces it is hard to read. I'm sorry for that. Maybe it's the light. Anyway, what you would see anywhere in any cell of that matrix is a very high correlation. It's like the lowest would be around 0.8. So all the items, they correlate among each other, which means that people who would like the EU to deliver in economic area would like also the EU to deliver on democracy, or quality of democracy or peace, and they would even like the EU to have some more federal institutions, or maybe directly elected president and so on. Now, the second thought community is slightly different. And what is the most differentiating attribute or in the nature of this thought community is that they don't link public policies and the polity together. So these are people who may want EU to deliver public policies, but are not willing to acknowledge that the EU needs institutions, and those institutions need competencies, EU-level decision-making competencies to deliver such policies. So you have people, and not few people, quite many people, I would say, who would like EU to deliver peace, who would like EU to deliver higher quality of democracy, welfare, for example, but they don't want EU to have decision-making competencies in Brussels. We can have a discussion why is that so. We have certain, I would say, working hypotheses, but based on this data, and only on this data, we cannot answer that for sure. Now, I forgot to say that these dendrograms and network diagrams, these are for Poland, because we studied this in 6 countries, but we decided to show Poland since we are here. So, okay. And this is the correlation matrix where I highlighted those items that correlate among each other on a higher level and left out those that correlate on a lower level. I used 0.3 as a threshold, and the same here. 0.3 is the threshold for which items are connected or not in the network diagram. Okay, I will come back to that slide, but this is what Josef already indicated in his part, and what I try to explain as well. If we take those 2 thought communities, we know how they constitute the image of the European Union. We know how they link or not link polity part and public policies part. But again, it doesn't tell us anything about the level of trust or Euroscepticism for that sake. So we looked at how these thought communities trust selected European institutions. We have the European Council, European Parliament, not European Commission, European Parliament, and the Council of EU here. And we can see that in both communities, you have people with very high trust to all 3 institutions, and people with very low trust to all 3 institutions. So we call them federalist statists, meaning people who see the European Union as a federal political system, and at the same time they accept it, they want it. And then on the other hand, you have nation-state statists, so these are people who see the EU as a federal union, as a federal state, but they don't want it. They reject it. And the same goes for pragmatists. You have supranational pragmatists on the left-hand side or in the blue, and the nation-state pragmatists in the red. And of course, there are many undecided in between. There are much more undecided in the first thought community. And they think that the reason is that these are people who think about or consider European issues a bit more, in a more detailed. They maybe understand it a bit more, but they cannot evaluate what to do about it. And a similar graph for the Euroscepticism indicator. The question asked people how they see or what they would like EU to look like, and they had 4 options from exit option, our country should leave the EU, and then to remaining option, but the integration should be reversed and we want less decisions at the EU level. Then the third option, that our country should support the current form of integration, and the fourth option, that something like United States of Europe should emerge, approximating again federal union. And again, you see that in both thought communities, you have people who are in favor of federalization, and you also have people who are strongly against it and are in favor of exit. Not much. The most exiters are in Italian statists and French pragmatists. This is a bit higher share of people who would like their country to exit, but the rest is quite expected value based on other surveys that I am familiar with. Okay. Okay. Okay, 1 minute. So conclusions. So to conclude, the populations in 6 countries we studied do largely support a form of European Union as a club of republics, or as a union of sovereign states. Although we need to say that the share of people who see the EU as a federal state or federal union is not negligible. It's still around 1/5 or more. So it's not like there wouldn't be any such people. The way people see the EU, the way they make sense of it, the way they imagine it, is not in any way predicting trust or public policies approval, which we measured as well, but it's not in the presentation, or considering some principles like freedom of movement to be important, which we measured as well, but it's not here, or Euroscepticism, as you could have seen. We also found that there is correlation between voting for sovereignist leaders and parties and membership in pragmatist community, and this was particularly strong in Hungary and Poland. Okay. We found some more differences between Hungary and Poland and also Slovakia. So the 5th point highlights that the Visegrad 4 group of countries, or the Central Eastern Europe countries, might not be so homogeneous as it is often said, but we may get back to that in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, and we still have, let's say, 13 minutes for questions, comments, remarks. Okay, Max, is there any mic over there?
You go first. No, I think someone else was first.
Yeah, should I go? Yeah. So thanks for a lot of really interesting presentations. I have just a quick question, essentially, to Josef. And this last paper, it strikes me that, something, that could explain this large discrepancy between the statists and the pragmatists all across the board, essentially, is levels of education and level of education and level of political sophistication. If it is the case that, statist thought communities, that those are sort of characterized by connecting policy and polity, that requires a different level of abstract thinking about politics, especially supranational politics, than just, saying, oh, well, I like the policy. So it would be interesting to see if you have something sort of broken down by levels of education, or if you have some sort of measure of this in your data, And the last point is, first of all, I want to commend you on this Euroscepticism indicator. It is a much more sophisticated measure than a lot of the ones that are being used currently. But in terms of like the conclusions that you draw from it, when you ask people something like the United States of Europe should emerge, I'm not convinced they're thinking of a federal Europe. I mean, I would imagine that that might also give rise to, you know, this idea of like a super Europe, essentially a supranational state. So maybe, I mean, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the analysis, but mainly just the conclusions that you draw from that with regards to federalism. Thanks.
Thanks. Maybe I can just link the first two presentations, Sergio's and Jan's. And whereas Jan said that he might sound like he was coming from a different galaxy, it seemed to me there's actually more common ground in your analyses, perhaps, than you suggest. I mean, if I understand Jan's account, it's a sort of a story of domination by network. And if I understand Sergio's account, it's a story of domination by the European Council. And it seems to me that that's exactly the point, that in certain extreme situations, institutions become networks, and you actually get the two things intersecting. So it is exactly in those emergency moments that the network starts to, the council becomes that, but it's not just the council, it's also technocratic institutions, it's a whole range of institutions behaving in ways that don't really correspond to the institutional roles that one might expect of them in normal times. If I could just push you both, though, on the suggested responses to this. Jan, if I understand you correctly, your suggestion is that we should think more of formalizing networks, in other words, bringing them more out into the open, making them more visible, and here you connect to your points about cities and about institutions such as the ILO and so on, which, I mean, I would imagine visible entities are better than invisible ones, but at the same time you have all the issues you yourself raised about, well, which networks, how do we distinguish between the good networks and the bad networks, and that seems to me to take us back to questions of institutions and procedures. And Sergio, if I understood your line of argument, it was more to think in terms of counterpowers, countervailing forms of power that could counter the kind that one sees manifested in institutions such as the European Council, which again to me sounds better than the absence of those countervailing powers, but at the same time, presumably the effect of equal and opposite forces is some kind of stasis, some kind of maintenance of the status quo. And it seems to me that the shortcoming, therefore, of thinking just in terms of counterpowers is that one doesn't really move beyond the current institutional settlement, the current policy settlement, and so on. It seems to me that one would rather be looking for ways of developing political power that's more responsive to social power, to the power that might be wielded by the people, however one designates it. And so to me, that's not a question necessarily of dividing and counterbalancing, but a question of making institutions more responsive to sources of power beyond themselves. And I can't see what could do that other than some kind of democratization process playing out at the level of a federal union. I think that would be probably insufficient for the reasons that Jan mentions, but nonetheless necessary. Anyway, so my question would be if I could just push you both a little bit on the suggested responses. I think there's common ground in your diagnosis, but I find both of the suggested responses things that I'd want to push you a bit further on.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to actually just to mention that there is research coming out of Denmark by Dr. Martinsen and Anna, her doctoral student, on implementation networks and also accountability issues related to these, because the EU relies a lot on implementation networks in order to get things done. And the last paper now is actually going to be looking much more explicitly at accountability, and I think that's very important. It picks up on this issue of networks and how you can rein them in some ways. Now, I also had a question or reflection to I think mainly to Jan, but maybe also to Sergio, and that is that I think you also talk about a gap between our conceptions and what is happening. And Johan Olsen, in his book from 2017, was talking about Norway, which is exceptional in the high level of trust people have in government. At the same time, that there were 3 reports that came out and pointed to significant flaws in how the political system was working. But these didn't have any impact on the level of trust. So there's something interesting going on here, that analysis of systems or changes and so on don't necessarily feed into. So I don't understand the relationship between people having trust and what is actually happening, the performance. So there is a buffer here somehow, a kind of a legitimacy buffer. And I think that pertains to the kind of concepts and so on people have, assuming that a sort of sovereign state and democracy and so on and constitutionalism and so on, this is working, sometimes even as a Potemkin village. But it probably helps to sustain the trust. And then the question is, when do you encounter distrust? When there is not a direct translation between a decline in performance and performance and the people's levels of trust. So I don't know what the mechanisms are that translate or transmit between these things. So maybe also it could have something to do with the relationship between state change and stability. And I think people can live with larger gaps under conditions of relative stability. But when you have rapid change that operates on several levels, you get epistemic insecurity in a much more profound way. And then that can also have legitimacy implications. And I mean, this is a very realist notion that I'm trying to look at now. I haven't, I bracket normative standards, anything like this, but there are some puzzles here in terms of how political systems are operating that I don't know how to approach. And then I think coming back to what we talked about earlier, Bridget's question about the policy, I do think that is very important. And again, I think what we are seeing with modern states, and that actually is a measure of responsiveness, that states are bypassing procedures and so on in order to get things done. So this is what Oren and Skowronek write very well about. They don't take a stance. They say, okay, we are observing this. We haven't made up our minds as to whether this is something positive or not. It gets things done. It is responsive, but it can, at the same time, lead to such a strong bypassing of institutions that the solidity of institutions is then undermined. You can veer so far away from them that you are in a different type of terrain, and that also lends itself to the thinking about networks and so on. So these are elements that I think we probably need to focus on more. And then you also have this intriguing book on the policy responsiveness trap, or the policy accumulation trap, which is talking about the fact that democracies are responsive and they say yes to do things and they set things in motion and so on, and then you have implementation bottlenecks. They don't actually make and get things done. And then this is feeding populism, because, especially right-wing populism, because they say, look, the system is dysfunctional. It's not working at all. So you have to change it and so on. You see that in a lot of cases. So this is actually also democratic mechanisms that are working, because systems are responsive. But in order to get the capacity to do all the things, and then they go through bypassing procedures and all this, and then we are in this type of terrain. So these are just observations, but I think we probably need to take these into account too. I don't want to end up in a conservative camp of saying that, oh, the state should be limiting its obligations and so on. This is not where I want to be.
Yeah, thanks for, again, a very interesting, inspiring panel. I have a question and maybe a little bit of a challenge to Sergio's connection between enlargement and pathologies of sovereignty differentiation. So you cite, of course, the literature of the work of Frank Schimmelpfennig on sort of enlargement and differentiation, but that is sort of the instrument, the temporary differentiation for the capacity reasons, and this is the problems that could be solved. So while you identify the main problems in terms of democracy and accountability with the sovereignty TDI, and I was wondering how further enlargement of the EU would change sort of the pattern. Wouldn't, if there is sovereignty TDI from the part of the new member states, wouldn't they also occur in the same already differentiated policy areas of core state powers that we already see? So would the, why should that add up sort of to the problem that you identified now for the EU27? And shouldn't sort of the possible conditionality of enlargement expressed by, for example, Scholz, who you cite, that sort of moving away from unanimity, reforming decision-making rules to be able to absorb new members, shouldn't that sort of counteract the worry of the EU becoming more like an international organization? Because even if the European Parliament is not getting more power, even sort of moving away from consensual decision-making in the Council is a sort of, would be a sort of democratic reform in a way that moves away from the purely IO model that you criticize for good reason. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I have a practical observation, and I would love Professor Fabbrini and Professor Zielonka to comment on that. Namely, that a certain dysfunction in the decision-making process in the EU, the fact that the Council is very often deadlocked, and you have all these sovereignist tensions there, and it's not so easy, as you rightly described, that this is creating problems institutionally and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that in practical terms it means that actually the Commission is becoming the center of gravity in the EU. And if you look how the position of Ursula von der Leyen has changed since she was appointed, during the COVID pandemic, and then now during the Russia's aggression on Ukraine, suddenly, you know, I'm told by diplomats that, you know, in the Council she calls the shots. So maybe the Commission isn't as toothless as we think.
Shall we start from Sergio? You also had a question and a comment.
Okay, so I can make the answer. So I can start with a question to you, and then I go to my answer, right? So no, the question is the following one. At the very end, I found very interesting. Indeed, Joseph sent to me the previous version of the paper. At the very end, you are basically creating two thought community with the statist perspective, because also the pragmatists are national statists, and the other one are European statists. So, and here is the Max Weber obsession that we are working in. Right? Without state, we cannot think about politics, right? So I don't want to cite too much myself, but my work, I know a little bit more than other works, but the four that I try to do with, starting with compound democracy, is to think historically and analytically to the possibility to set up central capabilities without a state. And so if the concept of federal union is exactly the alternative to the concept of federal state. But the federal state is popular in Europe because it's connected to the German model. And the role of the German leadership, particularly in the European Parliament, but also in the Commission, has been crucial in order to frame the federalist perspective of Europe in status there. And I would say that the success of this model has been also the cause of his defeat, because it is illiberal in any case to set up a federal state in Europe, but also is unrealistic. So what I'm trying to do with the federal union is to think that you can have a compromise, what we did in the policy brief, and you can increase core state power capability, and you can decrease the control, unnecessary control of the single market regulatory policies. Probably is not up to the European Commission to decide how to change the timetable with the change of the season. So there are many things in which you can go in that direction. So I was wondering what would happen if you would ask people saying, okay, here is the Macron, I don't know what else, sovereign states in Europe, this is the national, and what about a third alternative? Anyway, so the question that were raised are very important, Jonathan. That point is connected to what I asked them. That it seems to me that first we have to open up a discussion on the European Council. You did already with your work, and so it started an emergency power, but at the very end it became the executive of the European Union. Is it possible to have an executive of 27 member states according to democratic criteria, or is just an international diplomatic arena? And what I'm saying that you have to open up a discussion not only on representative deficit in Europe, but also on governmental deficit in Europe. That we take decisions without having a government, which is fine, but we have to at least to identify a locus of decision-making which is able to respond. And my question with my research is to show that that cannot happen. So the counterpower is not only to increase the role of European Parliament, but also to decide between the Commission and the European Council who is in charge of the executive, not of the government, of the executive decision. I think that is a theoretical question that we have underestimated in European Union studies. We take for granted. And there is a competition between those who say the new intergovernmentalists, oh, the European Council is the new power, but then you have the neo-functionalists say, no, the Commission is important. The question is, we need to go over that, also to answer your question, that there is not clear from a democratic perspective where is the executive power in Europe. And at the same time, we ask Europe, European Union, to take decision, which is, I would say, a good theoretical challenge for us. And also, that brings to Max's question. It's not that you say, I don't, you say that the enlargement differentiation issue, of course, you can integrate, you can adapt. You can do a lot from a pragmatical point of view. However, do you, this is a discussion, an academic discussion. I don't want to enter, I don't want to be interpreted in political terms, okay? I do that as a scholar, as a political scientist, not in political terms. But would you think that Ukrainians within the European Union would accept a decision taken by the European Court of Justice? Or would you think that the Ukrainians would not bring in the European Union a more nationalistic approach to the process of integration? What we have today, please interpret me as a scholar. And I don't, I don't want to enter in political terms, but I am very sensitive. I am loyal with the Ukrainian resistance. I'm staying, I also as a public intellectual, I write every Sunday morning in Sole 24 Ore, one of the newspapers, always in support of Ukraine. So this is not the issue. The issue is that this new country necessarily entering the European Union for building their own national sovereignty. They need the European Union for setting up a state, a nation state, where at the very beginning we create the European Union for taming the nation state. This is a conflict of concept that, at least as a scholar, we should consider. So you can do, okay, we do majority voting. My personal opinion, it will be very difficult to have majority voting in fiscal and foreign policy or security policy. The passerelle, you know, the passerelle is a clause in the treaty that allow to vote unanimously for voting through a majority. You need to go to vote through unanimously. Do you think that Orban would accept, or Morawiecki would accept, to go to a position of majority voting on those issues? It seems to me very unrealistic. So, but just to say, Meloni, and tomorrow, Le Pen, and tomorrow, Le Pen. So you will have a European Council, the only institution able to deal with sovereignty issue, with leaders within the European Council that stop any solution of the sovereignty issue, and they have no other institution checking what they are doing, or to which citizen can appeal in order to check what they did. That is the paralysis of the European Union. I don't think, the human agency will find some solution. I will do my best for finding such a solution. But as a scholar, I think we have the duty to consider the worst scenario. Okay.
I will answer the question, but let me first tell you that this is supposed to be a session about the future, but I have a déjà vu, because I happened to work on previous enlargement when Poland and others were supposed to come to the European Union, and the argument was exactly the same. And the Union is still there, and there is a rise in sovereignism, but for different reasons, not for the reasons we just discussed. I mean, of course, none of those countries was at war at the time, but there were more of them, and the arguments were exactly the same. But on the networks, look, the conservative solution would be, why don't states be simply wise? They start to work with those networks, work in hand with them. In fact, countries like Holland, which have always done this, in Holland, the government would never take decision on anything without Randstad. Randstad is the corner between Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Utrecht, because this is a generator of wealth, educations, everything, and it is not in the constitution. There is not even statistics about Randstad, and everybody knows in Holland that you cannot make any decisions without working with them. So you can say this should be applied to other cases. But this is a theory, because in reality, in politics, we have that states, exactly, politicians try to reclaim their sovereignty, although neither, Macron is interested in European sovereignty, but the EU not necessarily, because Macron thinks in statist terms, so he uses the term sovereignty, which is very statist. It doesn't apply to this. Yeah. Exactly. But certainly cities are not interested in sovereignty. They are interested in other things. But sovereignists are not only against trying to get back powers from the EU. They try to also to carp on cities diplomacy, networking. They also clamp on NGOs these days. NGOs in many of the states are treated as criminals. I mean, this is outrageous. So. But the paradox is that not only sovereignists want to go back to the old world, democracy scholars want to go to the old world. I mean, I just reviewed 3 books on democracy by most prominent colleagues of us, Kalun and Taylor, Fukuyama, and Stein. And they dealt with internet revolution. They all realized that things are not good. So what is the solution? To go back to the original model of democracy. But for me, it's water under the bridge. I can imagine the world without democracy, but I cannot imagine the world without the internet. Sorry. And when you talk internet, in terms of actorness, you cannot just go away from networks, because these are basically they were empowered by internet. Because networks were since immemorial times much older than states. But the internet revolutions basically generated the change. And we don't know, because I'm, as a trained lawyer, I would, like Sergio, go for regulations or some kind of clarity. But I don't know whether institutional solutions and law applies to exactly non-hierarchical, vertical, fluid, non-transparent bodies like networks. And this is the problem. Why we haven't been able to regulate the internet? Not only because of the power of tech, high-tech giants, also because we don't know how to bloody do this. And not to kill democracy altogether, you know, Chinese way. We don't know. And they are not successful, by the way, with networks either. And we are talking about, you know, we didn't even talk about financial, look at Adam, financial networks. I mean, everybody knows that financial networks, it's not just capitalists as the old paradigm, you know, says. These are financial networks which are operating totally in different universe, right? And no government knows how to deal with them. Networks on social media, so nobody knows how to regulate communication in democracies. So this is the problem which I think we cannot face. And if this is water under the bridge, you cannot turn the clock back. You have to somehow think a new way about this new world. But I'm the last one. I'm too old and too old-fashioned to have a proposal for this, because you cannot apply old thinking to something totally new. And you also have to be technically savvy. You know, and I cannot really solve problems with my bloody phone. I have to ask younger people to help me and to design a model of legitimating decisions by those actors. You know, this is probably not for us, Sergio, and neither you and me. But I say that I don't believe we can turn the clock back. And I finish here, because this is the challenge, probably, for the new generations of scholars and applications to the Horizon project. And I see he's totally scared by now.
Okay, let us make a miracle. And no, we have it over to you to answer in 1 minute all of these nice questions you got.
Well, I had a suggestion that I can answer those questions directly over coffee or dinner, so to save time. But if there are more people interested in my answers, I can try and make it in half a minute and leave the other half to Josef. Yes, we did what you asked about, trying to break it down and seeing the relation between socio-demographic indicators, economic status, size of residence, experience abroad, speaking many languages, and so on and so on. But it didn't work in a systematic way. So we would find, we did multinomial regression analysis, and you would find some effects to be significant in certain countries, but not all the effects in all the countries. So there was no like clear pattern.
Yes, indeed, you would not find any kinds of effect of education there, because I mean, very often you would have just people ticking off on one side in a way, you know, kind of a one-sided answer, all or nothing, and it could often be that it's quite simply thinking people as well. That's at least our interpretation. It could, you know. So the question about the United States of Europe that you asked, Martin, that's also an important one. And of course, we were thinking about this. How do we frame this? How do we formulate it? And I don't think that there is how can you make it more clear that you're actually thinking about a federation than saying United States of Europe, right? I mean, I think it's relatively clear that we are thinking about federation. And then coming back to Sergio's very important question for us about the third option. I think our data shows, you know, that 80% of, you know, of the respondents, more or less, in all of the member states that we looked at, all 6, are in fact pragmatists. So they expect policy outputs, but they don't necessarily connect it with an expectation of polity structure going with those outputs. So that tells us that that third option, there is about 80% of people, I think, that are open to that third option, whereas of course we don't know what that third option should be. But that's you know, for further investigation. I think you know, we have John Eric and I and others been working on this idea of segmented political order. That would be one way of framing it, one way of thinking about it. All of us, I think, are discussing what that third option should be. But I totally agree with you about the, you know, obsession with you know, with the state. Of course, political science as a discipline is obsessed with the state. It grew up with the state. Over the last 200 years or so. So we almost cannot think political science without the state. But we should, because of course political organization was there before the state of the modern kind. So we should be able to, you know, go back to the old days. And you know, Jan's idea of the neo-medieval empire, that's one way of thinking about it. But of course there would be also alternative ways, alternative concepts that we could use. But in general, I think it's so the Girondin version of a European federation that you are promoting, Sergio, which we are so familiar with, I think should be maybe something that we should be thinking about. Absolutely.
I just wanted to add that whatever the third option would be, most likely those 80% would split into support for what we call pragmatist thought community and the other third option. So, and the 20% would still be those statists.
Okay, thank you very much for wrapping up in such a speed. Now over to Magda with a bit of announcements, right?
Thank you very much. We are halfway through, so congratulate ourselves for, you know, reaching the first part of the deliverable concluding conference. Few comments. All of you are invited for official dinner that will take place in Farina restaurant. You have the details on program in arrival info. It's 5 minutes from Main Square and about 15 walking to 20 minutes from here to the city center. It's done for those of you who don't have functions to perform now, which is the General Assembly of the EU3D. All EU3D researchers are invited, but particularly we need to see here heads of the research groups from partner institutions. You know who you are: Jon Erik, Giuseppe, Josef, Diaz, Gisław, Sergio, Sabine, Ben, Dorte, Dirk, and Jan. So you need to stay. The rest may, or it also may to go and enjoy Krakow's sunny afternoon. And we hope to see you all at Farina restaurant 8 p.m. Yes, did I say something else? No, 8 p.m. as in program. Is that correct? Thank you very much and see you soon.